Our speaker today is Dr. Stephen Phelps, and his topic is Can Science and Religion Ever Agree? A Baha'i Perspective. Dr. Stephen Phelps received bachelor's degrees in physics and philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD in physics from Princeton University, specializing in cosmology. He served at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel for 13 years in its research department, where he coordinated the indexing and collation of the Baha'i sacred writings and their translation from Persian and Arabic into English. During that period, he concurrently held a research position in the physics department at the Technion University in Haifa and published original research on the masses of nearby galaxies. His recent published research includes a machine learning test for COVID-19. He currently resides in the Portland area with his wife and 3 daughters. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Phelps.
Thank you so much. I guess we have a choice of seeing my face or seeing my screen. I didn't prepare slides, but I do have, of course, notes and quotations that I'll be using. I don't know if it would be distracting to see sort of all of this text on the screen rather than me talking. I don't know if the hosts have a preference, but I can do it either way.
I think it would be fine if you just go ahead and, speak without your screen.
Okay, so you just see me.
Yeah, I mean, I think
okay.
That's, yeah.
Okay, so the question we'll be addressing today is whether science and religion can ever agree. You could probably guess what my answer is going to be, but maybe that would be a spoiler alert. So I will go forward. I guess first of all by answering the question in the kind of the simplest form, but then trying to go behind that question and look at what fundamental changes in our worldview will be required to really answer that question in the affirmative. Many of us may already be familiar with the fact that the principle of the unity of science and religion is regarded as one of the central teachings of the Baha'i faith. I think is fair to say that it's the only and first major religion to clearly formulate this principle and to put it so centrally in its among its teachings. Although it would also be fair to say that it's the only or one of the only existing world religions that could have, because the Baha'i faith, being so historically new, is also among the only post-scientific revolution world religions on the planet today. The principle of the unity of science and religion, as far as I've been able to see, was not explicitly stated by Baha'u'llah, although he mentions in positive terms the study of useful arts and sciences, although he mentions the wondrous sciences that will emerge in the future. It was left to Abdu'l-Baha, and in particular during the journeys of Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, to the West in 1910 and 1911, to explicitly formulate this principle. And Abdu'l-Baha did this repeatedly in the course of dozens of talks that he gave in Europe and in the United States in 1910 and 1911. And just to present you with some of the raw material that I'm speaking from, I'm pasting into the chat box a link to several dozen quotations from the Baha'i writings that state and restate this basic teaching of the Baha'i faith, of the compatibility of science and religion. The modern observer may immediately point out that this teaching of the Baha'i faith is by no means obvious, that there is a fairly manifest conflict between science and religion in the present day. Abdu'l-Baha, in his various talks, tends to lay the source of the conflict not so much at the feet of the scientific method, but at the feet of particular interpretations of religion. And one, I think, a very clear place where Abdu'l-Bahá does this is in a work called Paris Talks. This was given in Paris in 1911. And Abdu'l-Bahá puts it in the following terms. He says, all religions of the present day have fallen into superstitious practices, out of harmony alike with the true principles of the teaching they represent and with the scientific discoveries of the time. Many religious leaders have grown to think that the importance of religion lies mainly in the adherence to a collection of certain dogmas and the practice of rites and ceremonies. Those whose souls they profess to cure are taught to believe likewise, and these cling tenaciously to the outward forms, confusing them with the inward truth. Now, these forms and rituals differ in the various churches among the different sects, and even contradict one another, giving rise to discord, hatred, and disunion. The outcome of all this dissension is the belief of many cultured men that religion and science are contradictory terms, that religion needs no powers of reflection, and should in no wise be regulated by science, but must of necessity be opposed the one to the other. The unfortunate effect of this is that science has drifted apart from religion, and religion has become a mere blind and more or less apathetic following of the precepts of certain religious teachers, who insist on their own favorite dogmas being accepted even when they are contrary to science. This is foolishness, for it is quite evident that science is the light, and being so, religion, truly so called, does not oppose knowledge. We are familiar with the phrases light and darkness, religion and science, but the religion which does not walk hand in hand with science is itself in the darkness of superstition and ignorance. Much of the discord and disunion of the world is created by these man-made oppositions and contradictions. If religion were in harmony with science and they walked together, much of the hatred and bitterness now bringing misery to the human race would be at an end. So that's a fairly long quotation, but I wanted to read it all because I think it so beautifully captures the position of the Baha'i faith on the principle of the unity of science and religion. But given this, the fact of there being, I think, fairly obvious tension in the world today between the majority of the followers of religion, and of course one is lumping together billions of people into one, into one pool and saying this. But I think fair to say that the traditional interpretations of religion, as followed by the majority of religious people on the planet, at times put those beliefs in contradiction with conclusions of science. How do we go forward? If we want to declare that science and religion are united, what will be required to bring them into harmony? I wanted to talk about, and there's a lot of content in this talk, and I hope that that it doesn't overwhelm. But I wanted to discuss a number of points. Good talks, they say, always just have 3 points. But I'm going to have more like 10 points, 12 points. I'm going to talk about principles that are located within the Baha'i writings, what we might call deeper principles that can facilitate the reconciliation of science and religion by shifting our views, maybe in a fairly fundamental way, about what religion really is, and what some of the basic ideas that undergird our belief in religion really are. And these principles we will find challenge our given notions about certain basic ideas. For instance, the idea that matter and spirit are two different kinds of things. So let me talk about each of these in turn. And the first of these basic undergirding principles is how, again, and most of these will come from Abdu'l-Bahá. The first of these is the idea expressed by Abdu'l-Bahá that really it's more of a redefinition by Abdu'l-Bahá, a redefinition of religion and a redefinition of nature. Abdu'l-Bahá, in one of the talks that he gave in 1906, 1907 in Haifa, speaking about the nature of religion, offers us a revolutionary redefinition of what religion is, which on the face of it may appear to be in tension with our given understanding of religion as being something which is really a top-down phenomenon, something which is delivered from above down to the planet, which is spoken, by God to the prophet on the mountaintop, and the prophet then brings it down to the people. We all have this, I think, common intuition about religion. Abdu'l-Bahá offers us a complementary definition of religion in Some Answer Questions that goes as follows. And this is in chapter 40 of Some Answer Questions. He says that the manifestations of God are aware of the truths underlying the mysteries of all created things, and thus they found a religion that is based upon and consonant with the prevailing condition of humanity. For religion consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. And then later in that same talk, he says, for religion then consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. The universal manifestations of God, being aware of the mysteries of creation, are fully informed of these necessary relationships and establish them as the religion of God. I find this to be a fairly revolutionary redefinition, partly because to define religion in these terms is more of a ground-up definition. It's more of a definition that it sounds more like science. And indeed, in a later writing in 1919, Abdu'l-Bahá writes to a famous scientist, Dr. Farrell. And in this letter to Dr. Farrell, Abdu'l-Bahá discusses nature. And Abdu'l-Bahá offers a definition of nature in this letter to this famous scientist, which goes as follows. By nature is meant those inherent properties and necessary relations derived from the realities of things. And these realities of things, though in the utmost diversity, are yet intimately connected one with the other. For these diverse realities, an all-unifying agency is needed that shall link them all one to the other. If one looks underneath to the Persian text of these two letters by Abdu'l-Bahá, one finds that the slight differences in the wording in the English actually fall away, and you come up with identical Persian phrases that Abdu'l-Bahá uses to define, on the one hand, religion, and on the other hand, nature. They're both defined in terms of necessary relationships that proceed from the realities of things. So this is one principle, what we might call a deeper principle within the Bahá'í Writings, that help to fundamentally realign our understanding of nature and of what we might call the supernatural, the domain of heaven, the domain of earth, to realign them in ways where they're no longer opposed to each other, but in fact, different aspects of the same thing. The second principle of correspondence, deeper principle in the Bahá'í Writings, is the idea of correspondence between the higher and the lower. A principle of which is expressed again in a letter of Abdu'l-Bahá in the following terms. He says that there are two books. One is the book of creation and the other is the written book. The written book consisteth of the heavenly books which are revealed to the prophets of God and have issued forth from the lips of his manifestations. The book of creation is the preserved tablet in the outspread roll of existence. The book of creation is in accord with the written book. There's and this principle of correspondence between material and spiritual, the idea that there's almost a mirror relationship, that the structures and forms that one finds in one domain are repeated in the other domain. One might call it a principle of symmetry, is found throughout the Baha'i writings. Another example of this in a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha called the Tablet of the Universe. Abdu'l-Baha says, physical things are signs and imprints of spiritual things. Every lower thing is an image and counterpart of a higher thing. And in presenting this principle, Abdu'l-Baha is echoing a truly ancient idea that goes back, some say, to a shadowy figure named Hermes, who perhaps lived in Egypt even before the time of the pyramids. Baha'u'llah briefly mentions Hermes in one of his tablets. And Hermes is said to be the originator of this principle that whatever is above is like whatever is below, and vice versa. So there's this principle of repetition and symmetry that also help to unite what we thought of as these two separate and disjointed domains. The third undergirding principle I want to add to this mix is an idea found in Baha'u'llah's Tablet of Wisdom, where Baha'u'llah is discussing, on the one hand, nature, and on the other hand, God's will, which traditional theology tends to describe in contrary terms. Nature being that nexus of necessary relationships that flows upon the earth, unless and until God's will intervenes upon those necessary relationships and wills something else to happen. That may be our intuition about this difference between these two, we might say, great forces in the world. The average, the everyday operation of things is seen to be opposed to the special operation of things under the particular will of a deity, the particular will of a God existing outside of that nexus of relationships, who at times wills things to happen that might not be in accordance with that normal flow of things. This intuition, which is, I think, one of the bedrock intuitions that leads to tension and conflict between science and religion, is addressed by Baha'u'llah in his Tablet of Wisdom. And Baha'u'llah very simply deals with this tension by defining it away. Baha'u'llah essentially puts an equal sign between nature and God's will. And he does so in the following words. He says, nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. It is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. Were anyone to affirm that it is the will of God as manifested in the world of being, no one should question this assertion. It is endowed with a power whose men of reality, whose reality men of learning have failed to grasp. Indeed, a man of insight can perceive naught therein save the effulgent splendor of our name, the Creator. Abdu'l-Baha, writing years later a commentary on this Tablet of Wisdom, sums up this key teaching in the following sentence. He says, all the conditions and perfections that the philosophers attribute to nature are the same as have been attributed to the primal will in the Holy Scriptures. So both Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah take these two apparently opposing concepts with hundreds of years of thought behind building them up as these two separate domains. Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah say, look, there's been all along a misunderstanding that these are two different things when in fact they're really the same thing. Nature is defined as the operation of God's will in the world. And following the consequences of that redefinition, I think, come a fairly fundamental redefinition in our conception of what religion is, something more aligned with the idea of essential relationships proceeding from the realities of things. The fourth undergirding principle is the idea that, that matter and spirit are not just mirror images of each other, but whether one considers something as material or spiritual is a relative matter. There's a principle of relativity involved as to whether in one's observation of the world, one labels something as a material or as a spiritual phenomenon. And this is put in the following terms in a talk given by Abdu'l-Bahá. He says the following: the deniers ask in their disbelief, where is that world, that spiritual world? For whatsoever hath no actual material existence is sheer imagination. But the truth is that the world of existence is a single world, although its stations are manifold in accordance with the manifold realities of things. For instance, the world of mineral, plant, and animal existence is the same world. Despite this, the animal world, in relation to the world of the vegetable, is a spiritual reality and another world and abode. In just a few sentences, Abdu'l-Bahá here has, I think, turned upside down what we might have thought as a very comfortable, dualistic picture of the world, a world which is divided into matter and material things and processes and laws, and on the other side, spirit and spiritual things and processes. And Abdu'l-Bahá is offering to us here, I think, a different way of looking at the relationship between material and spiritual, not as two separate kinds of substances, let's say, in the sense of metaphysical dualism, but rather two different ways of looking at the world. And as Abdu'l-Bahá says, if you're looking at the world from the perspective of the mineral, then the vegetable kingdom, which in Abdu'l-Bahá's description of things is the next rung up in the hierarchy of existence in the chain of being, to the vegetable, Abdu'l-Bahá says, it is, or to the mineral, it is the, to the vegetable, he says, it is the animal kingdom, which is the spiritual reality. One could, of course, then take that principle and apply it all the way up and down the chain of being and say, well, to the mineral, the vegetable is the spirit. To the animal, the human is the spirit. And of course, to the human degree, there is a higher degree which we identify as the spiritual, but which is not really in a different world. Abdu'l-Bahá says in this same quotation, there is only one world of existence. And how we label it depends upon the perspective that we see it through. So the sixth and last undergirding principle that bears directly on the principle of the unity of science and religion is also an idea in the Baha'i writings of the nature of what we call divine revelation. Those words accorded a special kind of veneration that are brought together in holy texts and lovingly transmitted from one generation to the next. The idea that Baha'u'llah expresses, one of the central ideas of his book of Certitude, one of the earlier and most important works that he wrote, is that the nature of divine revelation has often been misinterpreted by its readers and by its sympathetic readers, not by the ones trying to disprove it, but by those very readers that hold it in the highest veneration, have tended to misread it and misinterpret it by considering the surface of it and not looking at the deeper realities that lie behind it. Because the revealed word fundamentally has a symbolic nature and ultimately should not be interpreted in a literal manner. And it is very often the literal interpretation of Scripture, particularly miracle stories, that leads to this perception of the conflict between science and religion today. Abdu'l-Bahá puts this again in one of his talks in the United States in the following words. He says, holding to literal interpretation and visible fulfillment of the text of the holy books is simply imitation of ancestral forms and beliefs. For when we perceive the reality of Christ, these texts and statements become clear and perfectly reconcilable with each other. Unless we perceive reality, we cannot understand the meanings of the holy books, for these meanings are symbolical and spiritual, such as, for example, the raising of Lazarus, which has a spiritual interpretation. So I've just offered 6 principles found in the Baha'i Faith that collectively help to redefine our understanding of religion, of spirit and matter, and of the relationship between them. This principle of religion as essential relationships, the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, and this idea of the repetition of patterns, the principle of the equation of nature with God's will, the principle of the relativity of spirit and matter, and the principle of the symbolic nature of the revealed word and the necessity for the non-literal interpretation. I want to go further into this topic and discuss next several common features of what the Baha'i writings describe as true science and true religions beyond these principles that I've just mentioned. Common features more in the sense of common approach and common way of looking at them. The first, it occurred to me as we were listening to this beautiful introductory quotation that was read just a few minutes ago, is this whole idea of science being a kind of divine bestowal, that there's something supernatural almost, although we know we don't literally mean supernatural, but there's something almost supernatural about scientific power and reasoning, the kind of power it gives us in the world. And this divinization, this sacralization of science and the scientific method puts it on, I think, a more even footing with what we think of more typically as spiritual pursuits and spiritual things. A second point is the common epistemology that is shared. And by epistemology, I mean a common approach to reality. And again, in all of these, I'm talking about what the Baha'i writings define as true science and true religion, and not the blind imitation and superstition that Abdu'l-Bahá excoriated in the opening quotation that I read from Paris Talks. This idea of the common epistemology, or that there is for followers of true religion a kind of a scientific posture, a posture of observing and examining everything with a searching eye, a posture of being somewhat wary of arguments from authority, and being willing, indeed responsible, for investigating the truth of things independently and for one's own. This is briefly stated, this idea briefly stated by Shoghi Effendi in one of his letters to the High Commissioner of Palestine in 1933. He says, "The revelation proclaimed by Baha'u'llah, his followers believe, is divine in origin, all-embracing in scope, broad in its outlook, scientific in its method." And in one of Baha'u'llah's tablets, Words of Wisdom, he says, "The essence of all that we have revealed for thee is justice, is for man to free himself from idle fancying and imitation, discern with the eye of oneness his glorious handiwork, and look into all things with a searching eye." So there's a common posture of seeking reality and of searching into things, and a willingness to question received authorities, particularly received religious authorities, which true religion shares with true science. A third commonality is this common conception of both religion and science that ultimately the universe constitutes an ordered system, that there is something undergirding things which can be described as order or even reason. Reason, by the one translation of reason from word from the ancient Greek, which is sometimes translated into the concept of order, is logos, which also can be translated as word, which is the opening phrase of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This word that was there in the beginning, according to the Gospel of John, this logos, can also be translated as a kind of ordering principle. There's something that orders the world that was there from the beginning. Baha'u'llah puts this very beautifully in a passage in The Gleanings, which is one of the central works of extracts of Baha'u'llah's writings, compiled and translated by Shoghi Effendi, Baha'u'llah's great-grandson. In this brief passage, Baha'u'llah says, "A sprinkling from the unfathomed deep of his sovereign and all-pervasive will hath out of utter nothingness called into being a creation which is infinite in its range and deathless in its duration. The wonders of his bounty can never cease, and the stream of his merciful grace can never be arrested. The process of his creation hath had no beginning and can have no end." We have this idea of this will that undergirds things, that calls things into being. The Bab, the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, whom Baha'is consider a prophet of equal stature to Baha'u'llah, says in his mother book, the Persian Bayan, in the sixth gate of the third Vahed of the Persian Bayan, the Bab says, "God created all things by his primal will, and this primal will by itself." So the Bab adds a twist to this idea of everything being generated by this ordering principle. And the twist is that the ordering principle generates itself. And there's a theological reason for this, because one cannot ascribe the act of creation to the divine essence itself, because that would be ascribing a form of limitation to that divine essence by saying even that God as creator is to add attributes to that which ultimately, in the end, can have no attributes, at least attributes that we can comprehend. This idea of the world creating itself through this ordering principle, some might suspect that this is starting to sound a little bit like the ideas in modern physics of the self-creation of the universe. Some ideas in Big Bang cosmology of the creation of the universe, not by the imposition of some exterior cause, but rather by the spontaneous emergence of things, as it were, perhaps as a vacuum fluctuation. This is one of the current theories in the science of cosmology. So that was this third commonality, is this idea that both in religion broadly speaking and in science, that there is an ordering principle behind things. The fourth, which is related to this, is the idea that everything has a cause, that there is an inviolable and unbreakable chain of causes which unites everything with everything else. Abdu'l-Baha puts this in the first chapter of his Some Answered Questions in very clear terms in the following words. He says, "Nature is that condition or reality which outwardly is the source of the life and death, or in other words, of the composition and decomposition of all things. This nature is subject to a sound organization, to inviolable laws, to a perfect order, and a consummate design from which it never departs. To such an extent is this true, that were you to gaze with the eye of insight and discernment, you would observe that all things, from the smallest invisible atom to the largest globes in the world of existence, such as the sun or the other great stars and luminous bodies, are most perfectly organized, be it with regard to their order, their composition, their outward form, or their motion, and that all are subject to one universal law from which they never depart." There's very much this common idea in the Baha'i writings shared with science of this inviolable, the idea of this inviolable physical law, the law of nature, which, as we know, Baha'u'llah identifies with the will of God. So we're not taking God out of the equation. We're putting God all the way into the equation through this redefinition of nature as the divine will. A divine will which, in certain aspects of it, can be described using mathematical laws. And a fifth and final area of consonance between science and religion is something which itself would be probably a series of talks, and so I'm only going to mention these very briefly. And this is similarities in, let's say, top-level structure between what physics, particularly what theoretical physicists have described as being the most fundamental structural descriptors of the world as we understand it, and some of the most fundamental principles of religion. And these top-level structures on the side of physics have been summarized in the book A Beautiful Question by the physicist Frank Wilczek, page 75 of A Beautiful Question. Professor Wilczek says the following: these big ideas, and he spends the whole book talking about them, so I'm just compressing it into one sentence. He says, these big ideas, relativity, symmetry, invariance, complementarity, form the heart of modern physics. They should be, though they are not yet, central to modern philosophy and religion. And I remember when I read this thinking, yeah, maybe they actually are central, at least to the Baha'i faith, if they're not central to modern philosophy and religion as currently understood. I can see this principle of relativity, the principles of symmetry and invariance, which are two sides of the same coin, and the principle of complementarity, also undergirding the Baha'i writings in a very fundamental way. The principle of relativity has been described as the fundamental verity underlying the Baha'i faith by Shoghi Effendi. In one of his earlier letters, he says, the fundamental verity underlying the Baha'i faith is that religious truth is not absolute but relative, that divine revelation is not final but progressive. And the idea of symmetry, or this idea of repetition of pattern, is another way of describing symmetry, is something which we've already mentioned, which Baha'u'llah, again in one of his tablets, the Lohe Hakun Nas, says the following and this really should be the topic of an entire talk on its own, but Baha'u'llah says this about this principle of repetition of pattern. He says, know thou that whatsoever can be found in this mortal world, this realm of limitation, every name and description, every form and attribute that can be seen or heard, hath in each world of the worlds of God manifestations and appearances corresponding to and befitting that world, and appearing with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute. Kind of a mind-blowing idea that there is a repetition of pattern, not just between what we think of as the material and the spiritual, but that every form and attribute, name and description has another name and perhaps another description repeated among all the worlds of God, these worlds of God being realms of consciousness. You know, where Abdu'l-Baha talks about the realm of the plant and the realm of the mineral, the realm of the human, and those realms of consciousness which lie beyond that of our own. There are repeating patterns, symmetries, and finally complementarity, the idea that what may be one from one perspective may be something else from another perspective. We're familiar in physics with the complementarity between particles and waves, which are the same yet they are different. Baha'u'llah gives this principle of complementarity again in his Tablet of Wisdom, where he says that the world of existence came into being through the interaction between the active force and its recipient. He says these two are the same, yet they are different. There's a principle of complementarity there. And also in Abdu'l-Bahá's Tablet of the Universe, Abdu'l-Bahá expresses this principle of complementarity in a number of essential pairs in the following terms. He says, earthly and heavenly, material and spiritual, accidental and essential, particular and universal, structure and foundation, appearance and reality, and the essence of all things, both inward and outward. All of these are connected with one another and are interrelated in such a manner that you will find that drops are patterned after seas and that atoms are structured after suns in proportion to their capacities and potentialities. Universal and particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. What we think of as these unchangeable categories, lenses through which we see the world, Abdu'l-Bahá assures us are all incidental and relative considerations. So these are all common features of true science and true religion. I gave 6, one being this idea of science as a divine bestowal, another being this common posture of investigation, the principle of the investigation of reality, the willingness to question, to probe things, to look into everything with the searching eye was the second. The third was this common idea of there being an ordering principle behind the creation of things, that ordering principle itself being its own cause. The fourth being this idea of natural law being inviolable, unchangeable, there being an unbreakable chain that binds all causes together. And the fifth being this common top-level structures that are found both in the realm of theoretical physics and very deeply within the Bahá'í Writings as well, the principles of relativity, of symmetry and invariance, and of complementarity. So after all of this, I hope that we still have time for discussion after this, I wanted to end this presentation by looking at a little bit of the flip side. So I've been emphasizing how it's all the same. If you look at it through the right lens, then what was up becomes down, what was spirit becomes matter, one might be left with the mistaken impression that science and religion not just are in harmony with each other, but are really the same thing. And I don't want to leave you with that impression either, because there is a distinction between science and religion. And what I wanted to just suggest, again, in 6 different points, all drawn from the Bahá'í Writings, are ways of thinking about what that difference might be. Help us locate and zero in on what the difference between science and religion are. And the first of these, and these should go faster than the last sets of 5 and 6 points, because I do want to leave time for questions. The first of these emerges from a reading of the 7 Valleys, which is that there's a distinction between, there's a difference between what Baha'u'llah in the 7 Valleys calls the eye of distinction and the eye of unity. And I believe this also is mentioned either implicitly or explicitly in other mystical works of Baha'u'llah during that tablet, which are published in the work Call of the Divine Beloved. In the 7 Valleys, the eye of distinction, the eye which analyzes, the eye which sees things as separated into parts, is a particular characteristic of the first 3 of the 7 Valleys of Baha'u'llah. These are different spiritual degrees and stations that the seeker traverses in their infinite journey to the Creator. And in the early stages, Baha'u'llah describes, the seeker traverses realms in which the law of distinction is predominant. The law that the lens of distinction perhaps is predominant. That one typically sees things as contrasting with one another. And one passes from this eye of distinction to the eye of unity in the 4th valley of the 7 Valleys, and the remainder of the 7 Valleys are all traversed through this eye of unity, which, in contrast to analysis, emphasizes more the synthesis of things, sees things more as wholes, sees holistically, passes from dualities and dualisms to monisms, passes from the idea of matter and spirit, for example, being two different things, to this idea of, well, it all depends on your perspective. Passes from the idea of this prophet and that prophet are saying different and contradictory things, and advances to a way of looking at the world in which one sees the harmony behind the apparent differences. The second distinction in the Baha'i writings is the distinction between the Arabic words here are ilm and irfan, which can be translated as knowledge for ilm, and for irfan perhaps something like intuition or insight. And this pairing is found not just in the Baha'i writings, but in Islamic philosophy and Sufism quite pervasively. The idea that there is a distinction between these two different modes of knowing. The mode of knowing of ilm being kind of like the knowledge one gets of fire by reading about it in a book, versus the knowing of irfan, the intuition of irfan, which is the knowledge of the flame that one gets from touching and being burned by the flame. Both of them are knowledge. Both of them are ways of knowing the flame, but how vastly different one is from the other. The third distinction or differentiator is between the idea of encompassing versus reflecting. One finds in various places in the Baha'i writings, and I'm omitting the quotations at this point for the sake of getting through to the end, one finds the idea of encompassing as fundamentally defining the activity of the intellect, the activity of the human understanding at an earthly level, the power of ilm as being this power of encompassing. Abdul Baha says that we understand things metaphorically because our realities are able to surround those things. They encompass those things, and because they're able to surround them, they comprehend them in all their parts, and they understand them. And this is contrasted with the power of reflection, which is like the reflection of the sun in the mirror. And the difference between encompassing and reflection, both of them comprehend the thing that they're contemplating, but the power of reflection is able to reflect something which is infinitely greater than itself. The mirror of the heart can reflect the infinitude of the sun and capture perfectly its disk and its brightness without encompassing its reality. And there, I think, lies, I believe, some key to understanding the difference between ilm and irfan. This difference between understanding by surrounding or encompassing and understanding by reflecting in the pure mirror of the heart. The fourth is the principle of verticality, which differentiates true science, which differentiates ilm from irfan, let's say. The principle of verticality, to try to state it briefly, is that we human beings and everything in the universe exists, as it were, on a journey, which is proceeding from the one and returning to the one. And this journey, as it proceeds from and returns to the same one, ultimately forms a kind of a circle. It's a circle of existence. This circle comprises arcs, arcs of descent and arcs of ascent. And what you define as being the arc of descent and the arc of ascent is entirely dependent on where along that circle you are. So we, being human beings, like to put ourselves at the center of things, and so we see ourselves as being in this special position, exactly halfway down the arc of descent and up the arc of ascent. And what we consider as spiritual or physical, how we look at the world, depends on our orientation with regard to that circle of existence. We are, like it or not, whether we admit it to ourselves or not, whether we realize it or not, passing from and to our ultimate goal. We do have the choice of orienting ourselves backwards from the direction we came or forwards in the direction of our goal. And therein lies the difference between a scientific, one might say, or a materialistic mindset and a spiritual mindset. A materialistic mindset which, looking backwards, sees just the physical things, the things which are before us on the arc of descent, and the spiritual mindset seeing the things that are ahead of us, representing higher degrees and grades of consciousness. This is not to assign an ethical weight to it necessarily, in the sense that there is a purpose and good to focusing on material things to sustain our material existence. At the same time, in the broadest scheme of things, the most important direction that we're faced with in this plane of existence is the forward direction, the direction which returns to the one. So let me just wrap this up and open up for questions with, and leave you with the idea that religion and science in the Baha'i writings are, if we leave ourselves and don't try to go beyond the given definitions, particularly of religion, then we would be forgiven for concluding that there is a contradiction between them that cannot be resolved. If we look into how the Baha'i writings discuss some of these fundamental theological categories like the will of God and spirit and so forth, we find that there is what we might think of as a complementarity between materiality and spirituality. There's almost as though religion and science are complementary systems of knowledge and practice. Complementary in the sense that one of them represents the horizontal direction, one of them represents the vertical direction. The horizontal being the physical world, which extends outwards infinitely in space and in time. There's an infinite number of things to know and explore within the reaches of this infinitely stretching plane, this plane of the physical world. But that's not all there is to the world. There's also a vertical dimension to things. It's that verticality which defines and differentiates what we think of as spiritual in contrast to what we think of as the physical. But it's all one three-dimensional world. It's just that it's divided into these different directions into which one can focus one's life and one's actions. And so we might end with the idea that that the mindset of the true religious person then can be thought of as merely the application of the scientific method to matters of the spirit, to matters vertical as opposed to matters horizontal. So let me stop there and open it up for questions and thoughts. And as the questions come and as the conversation continues, I'll be gradually cutting and pasting these quotations into the chat box so that you don't need to chase them down yourself. That might fill up the chat box and distract it from the questions, but I'm not sure if there's a better way to do this. Let me know.
I just wanted to thank you again so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I mean, I really like the part where you talked about like the commonalities between science and religion, like how the universe generates itself, and that could be like the will of God. It's just interesting how like religion is also a source of scientific thought and like powers. So now we have our Q&A portion. So if you have a question, you can either write it in the chat and I'll read it out, or you can use the Zoom raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You click participants and then it's a raise hand button in blue. So we have a question in the chat from Erwin. He says, please comment on the idea that the kingdoms of creation, mineral, vegetable, animal, human, manifestation are not limited to our planet.
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because there are few places in the Baha'i writings that I'm aware of where the writings seem to make a statement that has a direct scientific consequence. You know, most of them can be interpreted in some spiritual, way or other. That isn't necessarily saying something about science in particular, but there's something that Baha'u'llah says which is hard to interpret any other way. And he says this in one of his tablets. He says, know thou that every fixed star hath its planets, and every planet hath its creatures, whose number no man can compute. And a number of people asked Abdu'l-Bahá during Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry what is meant by this, and Abdu'l-Bahá in a few places explains further that by creatures is meant beings capable of knowing and loving God just as we are. So there's an idea in the Baha'i writings which I think has scientific consequence. And that idea is that the universe is filled with life. Almost as if the universe wants to be alive. You know, it wants to wake up. It's in the process of waking up and becoming conscious everywhere. It might be doing it at a different pace in different planets. Certain planets may remain cold and dark or hot and boiling for their entire existence, and not and the conditions for the emergence of complex life like on this planet may never emerge on those other planets. But that doesn't mean that they aren't part of this chain of being that Abdu'l-Bahá describes, within which, you know, even the plants, even the rocks are part of this process of unfolding consciousness. I mean, it might sound very counterintuitive and funny to say that rocks have spirit, but Abdu'l-Bahá says exactly that. He says even the mineral has spirit in its own degree. That spirit is a spirit of attraction, cohesion that makes the rock hold together and not be a gas or a liquid. So Abdu'l-Bahā's concept of spirit is something which extends all the way down the chain of being, so to speak. And it's partly within that perspective that we look out into the universe and we see the universe as being filled with life. And we see also that the universe wants to wake up and it wants to complete the circle. You know, it wants to return to the creator. And the way the universe returns to its creator is by conscious awareness. You know, the awareness of the human being of that own divine reality within can be thought of as completing that circle of existence. That being the case, we would expect the process of evolution as it unfolds throughout the universe, on other planets, other galaxies, and so forth, would eventually lead to the emergence of intelligence at least equal to our own, if not surpassing our own. The universe must be filled with life, not just life, bacterial oceans or forests, but intelligent life, life that also is asking where it came from and where it's going. That says nothing in particular, of course, about life visiting this planet, which seems, I believe, unlikely given the evidence that we have. But the fact of there being life out there in the universe, which we may someday come into contact with, we may someday perhaps communicate with thousands of years before we actually come in physical contact with it, is, I think, not just a virtual certainty from a scientific standpoint, but from the standpoint of the Baha'i writings as well.
Now we have a question from Babak, so I'm going to unmute you now.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thanks for your insightful talk. You said that science and religion share similar epistemology. So my question goes like this. In science consists of systematic search of truth with the power of observation and reasoning, like experiment and rationality. Whereas in religion, there are many propositions whose truths are God-given, are given to us, like the propositions in morality. So we know that backbiting is not right. That's a true proposition we cannot question. So do you see any conflict in this point of view?
I don't see a conflict because the givens of religion, from my understanding of the Baha'i writings, are never intended to be accepted without question by us. They're intended to be put into practice and their validity to be determined by applying them in the world. I mean, Baha'u'llah gives the example of, he describes himself not as the giver of unquestionable truth, but as the divine physician. In one of his most famous passages, he says, I'm the divine physician. I have my finger on the pulse of mankind of humanity. I perceive its sickness and I prescribe the cure. And that perspective invites us to look at the role of the manifestation as like a doctor who comes and says, I have this cure for you. Well, how do you know whether the doctor is true or not? Well, you apply the cure. And if the cure does what it says, then you know that the doctor is true. You don't accept every doctor who comes along saying, I'm a doctor, here's the cure. And you say, well, how do I know this cure is going to work? He says, well, because I'm the doctor. You can't question me. You know the cure is an effective cure when you test it out and it does what it says. In that sense, I think the two are quite consistent with each other. At the same time, as I stated, I didn't want to leave with the impression that the two are totally equivalent to each other. The insight that the prophets bring, the insight into the interrelationships that proceed from the realities of things, though they flow as consequences of reality, in a similar sense that the laws of physics flow from the consequences of the interactions of atoms. It's in that sense, it's scientific, and they are not arbitrarily saying do X, Y, and Z because I said so. They're saying do X, Y, and Z because it is ultimately in accordance with the structure of things. Though you, the prophet would say to us, though you may be unaware of the structure of things and unable of yourselves to unfold all of the intricacies of that structure, I'm coming at you from a position of greater awareness of those interrelationships. And the reason you can trust me is because when you try out these principles, when you apply them in your lives, they work.
Thank you. Thanks.
So now we have a question from Valerie, so I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you. Oh God, I have so many questions. Maybe I can ask one or two of them, but the first one is, I would love to hear your understanding of God as a physicist, as well as a Baha'i.
Great question. A long question. Would require a whole talk, I suppose. But to try to sum up how I personally have come to understand and see God, it is ultimately as a reality beyond being. I focus on, when I read the Baha'i writings about God, what catches my attention most are statements such as, God's names and attributes are beyond all comprehension. Among the names and attributes of God are God's oneness, God's existence. I mean, to say something exists is to attribute something to that thing. If the essence of the divine is truly beyond all names and attributes, as the Baha'i writings emphasize repeatedly, then that reality has to be beyond oneness itself, and beyond being itself, and beyond existence itself. Which means there's nothing we can do. I mean, we're stopped. We're halted at the limit of our search by this, as Baha'u'llah says, by his words, "Thou shalt never know me." And Baha'u'llah uses this metaphor of the tree beyond which there's no passing. The Sadratul Muntaha is this phrase which is sometimes found in the Baha'i writings. Well, what is that? In the trackless deserts of Arabia, sometimes a tree would be planted at the end of the road, and that would mark the end of the road. And beyond that, there is no more road. It ends at that point. And if you proceed beyond that, you're now going to get lost, because there's nothing to distinguish one direction from the other. And I think that's how I think of the concept of God, is that at a level of approximation, one can think about and relate to God as a being with one has a prayerful conversation, in which one is in a personal relationship. But that sense of God is, I believe, fulfilled by the relationship that we have with the prophet of God, with the manifestation of God. When we're talking about the essence of God, there is nothing, in fact, that can be said about it. There is only the trackless desert, the mist of unknowing.
Thank you. Would it be terrible if I asked my second question?
Go right ahead, thanks.
Scientists are really trying very hard to understand dark matter, and I'm wondering if you have your own sense of what that is.
No one has a clue. This is unfortunately, I think it's one of the biggest embarrassments to the whole field of cosmology. And I say that in the best possible sense. I mean, it's an embarrassment because here you have this substance which supposedly comprises the vast majority of all the mass energy of the universe, and we have not a clue what it is. I mean, if we have the sort of cosmic pie chart where we think that, you know, a couple % of the universe is matter, luminous matter, or matter made of atoms and protons and neutrons, like we know, and then this bigger chunk of it, you know, what is it, 30% or so is dark matter, and then an even bigger chunk, by the way, is dark energy, and we have even less clue about what dark energy is. We're left with this picture of reality in which 98% of the content of the universe, scientifically describable as having some mass energy equivalence, nevertheless, there are no theories that the scientific communities have been able to rally around and say this is the most likely thing. There are literally dozens of theories out there as to what this dark matter comprised. People are spending their entire careers, and thank God they are, just eliminating certain possibilities. I mean, imagine spending your whole scientific career building this detector, which might sit at the bottom of some mine in some godforsaken part of the world, and your whole scientific career is showing that nope, nothing was detected. And that's actually an advance. I mean, that's a significant advance for science. Some people have to do this because otherwise there are 100 possibilities, a million possibilities. And the only way to go forward in the absence of direct evidence is to start eliminating the possibilities one by one, finding some way of constructing some experiment that could differentiate between whether that thing is there or not. I hope to see, but although my hope was higher when I was actively doing cosmology 20 years ago. My hope was higher that at some time in my lifetime, we would crack this nut and find out what dark matter really is. But as far as the reading I've been doing, which is more from the outside in recent years, you know, reading the, you know, articles in the press and so forth, it doesn't strike me that anyone is any closer to it now than they were 20 years ago or 40 years ago.
Thank you.
So now we have a question from Liz in the chat, and she says, one of the things that has helped me become more accepting of various approaches to God is something you speak of in the summer school talks. It makes it easier to teach the faith when we can accept that there are multiple approaches, and that is okay.
Thank you. Yeah, this idea of relativity of religious truth, I think is so fundamental to my understanding of the Baha'i faith. And it goes so far beyond just the idea that religion is progressive, which it is, but the idea that religious truth is relative allows us to accept, embrace, and validate a whole range of approaches to these questions. You know, for example, the question of the nature of God. I mean, some people will naturally gravitate to thinking about God in impersonal terms, and others naturally gravitate to thinking about God in personal terms. There is space for both ways of thinking. One doesn't have to say, oh, this one is right and that one is wrong. I think that's one of the incredible strengths of the Baha'i teachings, and which it has to have if it's going to fulfill its promise to unite the religions of the world. It's not going to do it by creating a master doctrine that everyone on the planet is eventually going to sign on to and say, yes, I believe the following elements of this master doctrine. I don't think personally that that's how this thing is going to unfold. I think instead it's going to be more like a meta religion. It's going to be a meta perspective of a large umbrella, within which, in accordance with this principle of the relativity of religious truth, these various approaches, these various pathways towards the divine, some of which may look secular to us, others which may look, atheistic or non-theistic to us, but nevertheless have legitimate and valid spirituality of their own. All of these are going to find a place in the spiritualized humanity of the future.
We now have a question from Shahriar, so I'm going to unmute you now.
Allah Akbar. Thank you for your talk, Stephen, and the effort that you're making. I wanted to ask you in the context of the first question that was asked. In a lot of the Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah refers to the heavens and the Aradain, the two earths. Do you think, as a scientist and somebody who has a better insight in these things than I do, that within this cycle of the Baha'i faith, mankind will be inhabiting two planets?
Well, I think mankind will eventually inhabit millions of planets. The Bab goes further than heavens and the earths. He goes on and usually tacks on the additional phrase "wa ma bainahuma," or the heavens and the earth and that which lieth between them. And one finds this, in many of the prayers of the Bab. Whenever you see that phrase "and whatever lieth between them," you're reading a prayer of the Bab's. So there's this idea of infinite plenitude of life and consciousness being scattered throughout the universe. Wherever it's possible to emerge is going to emerge. Why would it be limited to one planet or two? If it's going to be on two planets, why wouldn't it be on 3 or 4 or a million? I think and hope that our destiny ultimately is to scatter our life and consciousness to the stars. That's the only way we will outlast the inevitable death and decline of our own star, of our own sun, which we know has limited amount of nuclear fuel, and has a predetermined lifespan. At the same time, it raises the interesting question of everything lives, has its time, and dies. Everything on this planet, every human life. And as we read Abdu'l Baha talk about, in some answer questions, about universal cycles, there's a chapter, I think 40 or 41 in some answer questions. He says there are these universal cycles on the level of civilizations as well, which are born and have their time and they die, and no trace remains, and another cycle begins. If we apply that principle to the planetary level, perhaps we won't go to the stars. Perhaps some astrophysical event will wipe out life on the planet before we manage to move to Mars or establish colonies on the moon or what have you. Suppose the sun goes and has, our sun has some kind of eruption or goes nova at the end of its life cycle, and all life in the solar system is snuffed out. The question then arises: what was the point of it all if our civilization and if life on this planet has an ultimate endpoint? Is that actually a problem? And well, if it's not a problem for human life to pass away and be replaced by the next life, if it's not a problem for a civilization to end without a trace, and then for another civilization to come along after it, then why would it be a problem for us to imagine that life on this planet may have an endpoint? Particularly if we believe that the universe is filled with life and consciousness. If that is the case, and I'm not sure that it is, this is just sheer rampant speculation, but if that is the case, then it would, I think, lead us more to, it would be a pretty profound insight in the sense that the purpose of things would then be located now, here, in this moment, rather than, well, the golden age that we may attain 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, or the thing that's going to happen further down the line. It's like where we locate the purpose of existence and where that purpose of existence is being served and where it's unfolding. Now it becomes the here and now, which I can't think of I can't immediately think of a more profound shift in consciousness than something like that.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Bella and Nathan in the chat, and they ask, do you have thoughts on Douglas Hofstadter's writings on strange loops? Some of the quotes you read reminded me of that. For example, logos creating itself. I previously thought all his examples involved something like a misperception or illusion, but your quotes make me think maybe there's more to it.
Yeah, I can't comment on strange loops in particular. Is this in Gödel, Escher, Bach? I read it in high school, and I can't remember the details of it. But certainly the idea of there being self-generation, perhaps related to this, is an idea expressed by John Wheeler in I think the 1960s or 70s. He was the originator of the idea of black holes, but he also had this idea of the universe coming to being through this recursive act of self-observation, which he called it from bit, which is I guess a strange loop of its own. But this idea, which was expressed in very mathematical and scientific terms, for which, of course, there's no direct evidence for, but it remains a potentially valid scientific theory of the origins of things, strikes me as not at all incompatible with the Bob's mention of the primal will, being self-created. Could not the universe be self-created in exactly that same sense? If quantum mechanically a system has to be observed to resolve into one of the infinite possibilities that it represents, then the question always remains, well, then what observed the universe? And one, I suppose, has two logical possibilities, although maybe it's a false dichotomy. Logical possibility one would be it's observed by something on the outside, which may be a sort of traditional theological conception of some God outside space and time that makes it all happen. But the other logical possibility is that the observation happened within. It was recursive act of self-observation, which strikes me as not that, as maybe a bit of a tangent, but it strikes me as not all that far away from something that the Bab said, quoted by Nader Saidi in Gate of the Heart, where the Bab talks about the soul. He says, the soul is, and this is a paraphrase of the quotation in Gate of the Heart. He says that the soul is a mode of the divine self-remembrance. We think of the soul as being some separate fragment of reality that's kind of floating separately from other souls and from God, and it's in the universe somehow. But the Bab describes the soul in truly mind-bending terms as a mode of the divine self-remembrance. In that sense, it's not separate from reality itself. It's a fragment of consciousness of the divine in a way. And in that sense, our knowledge of ourselves is equivalent to the knowledge of God. That's one of the Islamic hadith. He who hath known himself hath known his Lord. And through that act of self-observation, through that act of self-awareness or self-consciousness, one recapitulates in microcosmic terms the creation of the universe on macrocosmic terms. One participates in the creation event by becoming self-aware. Anyway, that's a bit of a rabbit hole, so maybe we'll stop there.
So I think this last one from the chat is going to be our last question in the interest of time. Kamran asks, please comment on God being immanent in nature and Baha'i perspective, that while God is presented in nature, but is beyond that. Baha'i writings have abundance of examples about elements of natural world and relating them to spiritual principles. Please elaborate on the Baha'i perspective.
Right, the question of, is God immanent or is God transcendent? It's one of the most fundamental theological categories that we would like it to be a meaningful category. We'd like it to be a meaningful question, to say, well, is God within all things, or is he outside and beyond and transcendent? Is he immanent or is he transcendent? And as I believe the answer is for almost all of these dichotomies, which we think of as fundamental, every dichotomy breaks down at some point. This particular dichotomy is actually broken down in the Quran, I think. You know, God says in the Quran, we will show them our signs in the world and within their own selves. You know, the afaq is the outer horizons, and the anfus is within the souls. And God's signs are supposed to be found within both of those. So there's an idea which is not original to the Baha'i writings. It goes back centuries, if not millennia, that the signs and evidences of the divine are to be found equally in the world beyond, sort of outside us, as they are within us. And we don't have to choose between them. We don't have to say it's one or the other. We don't have to say whether pantheism is ultimately more true than traditional theological theism or deism. This is actually a point explicitly made by Baha'u'llah in his tablet to Manachi Sahib, his Zoroastrian friend from Baghdad days, who wrote Baha'u'llah 9 different questions and Baha'u'llah answers. And these answers are collated in 2 different tablets that are translated and published in the Tabernacle of Unity. And in the longer of these tablets, Baha'u'llah quotes the entire text of the question and answers it. And that's how we know what the question was. And this question of Baha'u'llah's friend was about there being 4 different modes of thought, or 4 different ways of thinking about the relationship between God and creation. And Manachi Sahib ticks off the 4 different modes, which can be very, very simply translated in modern terms as theism, God being basically outside the universe, created the universe at some point, sends prophets every now and then. Pantheism, God is within all things, immanent, inside the world. Deism, that God created the world and then stepped back and is no longer actively involved. And then atheism or agnosticism is, well, who knows, basically. There's cycles of growth and death, and the prophets and the kings say this and that, but really they're just trying to create order in the world. So those are the 4 options which Manachi Sahib poses to Baha'u'llah, and he says, which of these is true? And Baha'u'llah doesn't say, well, option A. He says, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which you live and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. He says, worry about, he asks Manachi Sahib to be pragmatic and to go with what works, you know, and this is all in accordance with Baha'u'llah's own imagery in that same tablet of himself as the divine physician. But he goes on and he gives kind of a multi-layer answer to that particular question. And then in the end, Baha'u'llah says, one can find a justification for each of these 4 schools, because each of them is representative in some way of the truth. So that's a paraphrase of Baha'u'llah's answer, but he doesn't exclude one of these ways of thinking and only affirm another way of thinking. He's very typically, and this is not the only place it happens. Baha'u'llah very typically, when confronted with these dividing questions that divides truth from error in some very fundamental way, Baha'u'llah very typically answers that it's a little of both, depending on your perspective. And please don't fight about it.
Thank you so much again for your talk. It was so interesting. I think everyone enjoyed it. There were so many great questions. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker is going to be Dr. Farzam Kamalabadi, and his topic will be, why do Baha'is believe the promised day has come? And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Daylight Time, so please invite your friends and family. If you'd like to be on the weekly mailing list for these events, please reach out to the email that we put in the chat below. And now we're just going to close with a closing prayer.
Let me just interject. If you wanted the quotations that I was using, I can easily cut and paste them into a document and share them with the organizers, and you can find a way to share with others who request it.
Sure,
I didn't get a chance to cut it into the chat box, so paste it into the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
Glory be to thee, O my God. Thou hearest thine ardent lovers lamenting in their separation from thee, and such as have recognized thee wailing because of the remoteness from thy presence. Open thou outwardly to their faces, O my Lord, the gates of thy grace, that they may enter them by thy leave and in conformity with thy will, and may stand before the throne of thy majesty, and catch the accents of thy voice, and be illumined with the splendors of the light of thy face. Potent art thou to do what pleaseth thee. None can withstand the power of thy sovereign might. From everlasting thou wert alone, with none to equal thee, and will unto everlasting remain far above all thought and every description of thee. Have mercy then upon thy servants by thy grace and bounty, and suffer them not to be kept back from the shores of the ocean of thy nearness. If thou abandonest them, who is there to befriend them? And if thou puttest them far from thee, who is he that can favor them? They have none other Lord beside thee, none to adore except thyself. Deal thou generously with them by thy bountiful grace. Thou, in truth, art the ever-forgiving, the most compassionate. Baha'u'llah.
Have a great week, everyone. See you next Saturday.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.